Hello and welcome back. Or hello for the first time if you're new here, in which case good timing, tonight's a good one. I've been wanting to do a Homelander video for a while now. A proper one. Not a quick compilation of his greatest hits or a 10-minute theory video about Season 5, but just the whole story. Sitting down, going through everything from before he was even born, all the way through to where things currently stand in what is shaping up to be a genuinely interesting final season. The sort of video you can just let run while you're settling in for the night, not worrying too much about keeping up, because there's no test at the end and nowhere you need to be. If you're watching this on your phone in bed, or you've got it on in the background while you wind down, that's exactly where it's meant to be. We're not in a hurry tonight. So, Homelander. He's one of those characters where even people who've never watched The Boys have absorbed something about him through cultural osmosis, the cape, the laser eyes, the unsettling smile, the general energy of Superman if Superman had the emotional development of a very powerful toddler. He's everywhere right now, and for good reason. Anthony Starr's performance has been extraordinary across 5 seasons, and the character himself is probably the most interesting piece of social commentary dressed up in a superhero costume that I can think of offhand. But here's the thing about Homelander that I think gets a bit lost in all the memes and the discourse. He's actually a really sad character. Not in a way that excuses anything he does, and he does some genuinely awful things. We'll get to all of that, but in a way that makes him feel real rather than just cartoonishly evil. There's a logic to him. A coherent through line from the child he was to the man, or whatever he is now, that he's become. And I find that much more interesting than a villain who's just bad because the story needs a bad guy. Tonight we're going to cover all of it. His origins before the show even starts, what Vought International is and what it did to create him, his childhood in the laboratory, his early career as a superhero, and then every season of The Boys up through what we currently know about Season 5. We'll also spend some time on the psychological side of things, what's actually going on underneath all that bravado, and on his relationship with Ryan, which I think is the most emotionally complicated thread in the whole show. This is primarily the TV show version of the character, the Amazon Prime series. The comics exist and they're quite different in some interesting ways, and we'll touch on a few of those differences where they're relevant or illuminating. But the show is the main event tonight. A quick note before we get into it. If you'd like to support the channel, a subscription down below means a lot, and it helps these videos reach more people. But genuinely, no pressure, just settle in and let's get started. We're going back to the very beginning, before John ever existed, before there was a John at all actually. The Boys as a show is set in a world that is very recognisably ours, just with one fairly significant difference. Superheroes exist. They've existed for a while. They're real, they're famous, and they're owned by a corporation. That corporation is Vought International, which operates publicly as a superhero management and entertainment company, and privately as a pharmaceutical giant with a product that has made it arguably the most powerful company on Earth. That product is Compound V, and Compound V is more or less the beginning of everything. The Boys premiered in 2019 on Amazon Prime Video, adapted from a comic series by Garth Ennis and Derek Robertson that started back in 2006. The comic is quite different from the show in a lot of ways, tonally, structurally, and in terms of where specific characters end up, but the core premise is the same in both. Superheroes are not what they appear to be. The company that owns them is not what it appears to be, and the cheerful, patriotic, star-spangled image that's been sold to the public is built on a foundation of cover-ups, coercion, and violence. It's a show that's been running for 5 seasons now, wrapping up its final season as I'm recording this in 2026. It's been a wild ride, and Homelander has been at the centre of it from the very first scene. One more thing worth saying at the top. This is a show with quite a bit of graphic content in it. I'll be describing some events that are pretty dark, not gratuitously, just because they're part of the story. So if you're sensitive to certain things, just be aware that we'll be covering the full scope of what happens in the show, including some of the more disturbing parts of Homelander's history. Alright, with that said, let's go back to the very beginning. Vought International. Let's spend a moment on it, because you can't really understand Homelander without understanding the company that made him. And the company is genuinely one of the more fascinating fictional organizations in recent television. On the surface, Vought is a superhero company. They manage the Seven, their premier superhero team, along with a wider roster of supes who operate across the country. They make movies, merchandise, licensing deals. They have a streaming service called Vought Plus. They run press junkets and charity partnerships and sponsored events. They are, in the public imagination, the custodians of heroism itself. Underneath all of that, they're a pharmaceutical company. That's what Stan Edgar, the CEO for much of the show's run, is at pains to remind Homelander of in Season 2, when Homelander starts getting ideas above his station. "We're not a superhero company," Edgar tells him, in that absolutely flat, unbothered way that Edgar has. "We're a pharmaceutical company. Supes aren't their product. The drug that creates supes is their product. The supes themselves are just the most visible part of the sales strategy. That drug is Compound V. It's a synthetic serum that, when administered to a human being, has the potential to grant superpowers by fundamentally altering the body on a genetic level. The catch is that it doesn't work on everyone. The powers it grants are unpredictable, and the process of administering it, particularly to infants and young children, which Vought has been doing covertly for decades, injecting babies and then recruiting the resulting superhumans, later by pretending the powers emerged naturally, is, to put it mildly, ethically catastrophic. Compound 5 was developed by Frederick Vought, the founder of Vought International, who was a Nazi scientist. The show doesn't hedge on this. He was working in Germany during the Second World War, developed early versions of the compound, and then, in a move that is historically not entirely implausible, given what happened after the war, was brought to America under a program not unlike the real Operation Paperclip, which recruited former Nazi scientists for American government projects after 1945. He built Vought from there. He turned his research into an empire. This is the ideological soil in which Homelander was planted, which does a lot of work explaining certain things about who he became, though we'll get to that. Now, the decision to create Homelander specifically. By the late 1970s, Vought had a problem. Their flagship supe, Soldier Boy, more on him in a moment, had been around since the 1940s, was getting older and more difficult to manage, and was about to be handed over to the Soviet Union as part of a deal that, again, we'll get to when we discuss Season 3. They needed a successor, someone who could take over as the face of the company, as America's greatest superhero, ideally someone who was even more powerful than Soldier Boy, and critically, someone they owned completely. Not just under contract, actually owned, raised from birth to be exactly what Vought needed them to be. The solution was to go further than they ever had with Compound V. Rather than injecting the serum into an existing person, they'd administer it to an embryo, create a supe from conception, engineer the most powerful human being in existence before they were even born, and then raise that person in a controlled environment where every experience, every relationship, every piece of information they ever received could be carefully managed by Vought. For the genetic material, they turned to Soldier Boy. Benjamin, that's his real name, had donated to a sperm bank back in 1980, the way certain famous people do as a sort of legacy gesture. Vought took that sample and used it to fertilize an egg. The surrogate mother was a young woman, described in the show as a runaway, who Vought paid to carry the pregnancy to term. She presumably had no idea what she was carrying, or what Vought intended to do with the child afterward. The birth itself is one of the show's darker pieces of dark comedy. Told briefly in flashback during Season 2. The baby arrived already with his powers active. He lasered his way out of his mother's womb, literally, the heat vision firing from the moment of birth, killing the surrogate in the process. He then flew around the delivery room, still attached to the umbilical cord, and killed 3 doctors and a nurse before anyone could even begin to process what was happening. And that right there was the first impression everyone ever had of John, of the child who would become Homelander. Before he'd taken a breath, before he'd cried, before he'd done anything at all except exist, he was something that people were afraid of. The scientist in that delivery room who survived looked at the blood-covered flying infant and felt fear. And that fear, right from the very first moment, shaped absolutely everything about how he was treated for the next 2 decades. I always find that detail quite affecting, if I'm honest, which is a strange thing to say about a fictional character who grows up to do some genuinely terrible things. But there's something about the image of an infant who frightened everyone who ever looked at him, not because of anything he chose to do, but just because of what he was that sets the tone for the whole tragedy. Vought named him John. Dr. Jonah Vogelbaum, the lead scientist on the project, took primary responsibility for him, and so began what I can only describe as one of the more unusual childhoods in fiction. John grew up inside a Vought laboratory, not in a house, not in a neighborhood, in a lab, in a controlled environment, surrounded by scientists and researchers who were simultaneously responsible for his development and absolutely terrified of what they'd created. That tension, the terror underneath the professional obligation, permeated everything about his childhood. Vogelbaum was, by his own later admission, the closest thing John ever had to a parent figure in those early years, and he had genuine affection for the boy at the start. In Season 1, when Homelander tracks Vogelbaum down, decades later, retired old, Vogelbaum tells him that he deserved a loving family, that what was done to him was wrong, that he, Vogelbaum, was his greatest failure because he raised him without compassion, without a mother's love, without any of the things a child needs to become a person rather than a weapon. He apologizes. Homelander, predictably, doesn't find the apology particularly useful, but Vogelbaum's account of what happened in that lab is worth sitting with, because it wasn't always brutal. At age 5 or 6, by Vogelbaum's own description, John was a sweet child. He would cuddle up to Vogelbaum. He liked hearing stories, Davy Crockett, Teddy Roosevelt, the kind of American folk hero mythology that probably seemed harmlessly educational and was actually the beginning of a very deliberate ideological conditioning. He had something genuine in him at that age, something that could have gone differently. Vogelbaum made a choice to destroy it, not because he wanted to be cruel. He seems to have genuinely believed, at the time, that what he was doing was necessary. Vought needed Homelander to be the strongest, most capable, most aggressive weapon imaginable. A sweet, cuddly child was not going to fulfill that brief. So Vogelbaum deliberately withdrew warmth, deliberately structured an environment designed to make John violent, aggressive, wrathful. His words? In the apology, he knew what he was doing. He chose to do it anyway. The physical testing was extensive. Vought needed to know the limits of his abilities, and the only way to find limits was to push past them, which meant his hand in a furnace to test heat resistance, being submerged in boiling water, being made to fight Vought guards who'd been chemically enhanced to hold their own against him. Not because Vought thought the guards could win, but to observe how Homelander handled genuine physical opposition. Season 4 gives us a particularly grim flashback that shows lab technicians putting him in an incinerator, like a small experiment being run on a sample, watching through glass while he presumably screamed in there, testing how long it took for the fire to stop affecting him. If that sounds like torture, it's because it was torture. It was systematic, deliberately applied torture on a child. The fact that the child was physically indestructible didn't make it less traumatic. Indestructible bodies do not come with indestructible psychologies. He felt everything. He just couldn't be permanently, physically damaged by it. And the helplessness of that, the particular horror of having infinite physical power and no ability whatsoever to stop what was being done to you, is something the show returns to again and again as an explanation for who he becomes. The mental conditioning ran alongside the physical testing, hours, literally hours each day, by some accounts, in front of a projector showing patriotic imagery. The American flag. Jesus Christ! Baseball, bald eagles, mom and apple pie, more or less literally. Vought was trying to manufacture a worldview from the inside out, to make Homelander's sense of identity so thoroughly American, so thoroughly attached to certain symbols and values and aesthetics, that the performance would be genuine, or at least instinctive enough to pass as genuine. What it actually produced, according to some analyses of his character that I find fairly convincing, was something closer to xenophobia than patriotism. A reflexive disinterest in anything that didn't relate to America, a suspicion of anything that felt foreign or outside the framework he'd been taught. Not genuine love of country, but a kind of trained aversion to everything that wasn't the approved image, which is a fairly significant distinction, though one the public never got to understand. There's also the social isolation to consider. The other scientists in the lab, the ones who weren't Vogelbaum, were afraid of him, and as often happens when fear goes unaddressed, it curdled into something uglier. Season 4 reveals, in a particularly difficult scene, that lab technicians used to mock him, ignore his requests, make his existence deliberately more miserable in small grinding ways. The kind of cruelty that comes from people who know they can't actually hurt the target, but want to exert some control over something that frightens them. He asked for things and was ignored. He expressed distress and was observed rather than comforted. He couldn't hurt them back. That's the bitter irony. The most physically powerful being on Earth, as a child, could not retaliate against the people making his life miserable because Vought needed those people, and needed him controllable, and the consequence of hurting a scientist would have been severe in ways he'd learned early to avoid. So instead, at some point during childhood, we don't know exactly when, he scratched out the name John on a wall in the facility, just crossed it out, and started thinking of himself as Homelander. A name that wasn't a person's name, a name that was a title, a role, a performance. He stopped being John, whoever John might have become, and started being the thing they were making him into. That scratched out name is, I think, one of the most quietly devastating details in the whole show, because it marks the moment a child decided there was no point in being a child anymore. I want to spend a little time on one specific object, because I think it does more work than almost anything else in the show for establishing who Homelander is underneath everything. It's a blanket. In Season 1, Vought decides they want to produce a reality show segment featuring Homelander's childhood home, a way of making him feel relatable, grounded, regular guy with humble origins in the way that celebrity PR machinery is very good at constructing. The problem, obviously, is that Homelander doesn't have a childhood home. He has a laboratory. So Vought finds a house, dresses it up with props, and sends a crew to shoot Homelander walking through and reminiscing about a childhood that never happened. He plays along more or less, talks about baseball trophies that aren't his, makes up a story about cakes someone supposedly baked him, navigates a normal-seeming bedroom with normal-seeming furniture, and gives the performance that's asked of him, because that's what he does. And then he goes into the bedroom and sees, among all the generic props, his actual blanket, the one he really had in the lab, the one that was, as far as we can tell, the only genuine comfort object he ever possessed as a child. Something soft and warm, and his in an environment that was largely clinical and cold, and designed around his purpose rather than his well-being. He loses it completely, demands to know who put it there, storms out furious, and won't come back to film the rest of the segment until Madeline Stillwell finds him in a barn and talks him down. It's played with the appropriate weight. The blanket was never supposed to be there, Someone at Vought, trying to be thorough, found it in storage and included it as a real prop without understanding what it meant. And what it meant was, there's a room full of fake versions of a childhood he never had, and right in the middle of it is the one real thing. The one thing that actually belonged to John, whatever was left of John after everything. Homelander's anger in that moment isn't really about the blanket being included without his permission. It's about the violation of the only real thing in a world made entirely of fictions. It's about the juxtaposition, the fake baseball trophies and the real blanket existing in the same space, making both feel wrong. It's about someone touching something that mattered without knowing it mattered, which is its own particular kind of grief. And Stillwell handles it the way she handles everything with him, by being calm, by giving him something that feels like warmth, by doing the emotional management that is more or less her entire job. She finds him in the barn, she talks to him, she soothes him, and he lets himself be soothed because she's the person in his life who can do that. At that point, she's the closest thing he has to safety. We'll talk about Stillwell properly in a bit, because that relationship is its own whole chapter. But I wanted to linger on the blanket first because it says something important. Underneath all the power and the performance and the violence, there's someone who had a blanket they cared about as a child. The specific sadness of that is, I think, what separates Homelander from a purely cartoonish villain. There's a version of this story, if you squint at it from a different angle, that's genuinely heartbreaking. A child with no family, no love, no privacy, no genuine relationships, who found some small comfort in a blanket, and who carries that into adulthood as the one remaining trace of the person he was supposed to be. And then there's the other version of the story, which is everything else he does. Both versions are true. The show insists on that. I find that quality in the writing, the refusal to let you fully condemn him or fully sympathise with him, to be one of the things that makes Homelander genuinely interesting to think about. He's not a straightforward villain in the way that most superhero stories require their villains to be. He's something more uncomfortable than that. He's someone who had every possible thing done to him to ensure he would become a monster, and who then proceeded to become one. And the question of where the responsibility lies for that is not a simple one. I don't have a tidy answer to it. I'm not sure the show does either, but it keeps asking the question, which feels right. The diabolical animated series The Boys Presents Diabolical ran in 2022 as a companion anthology to the main show, and most of its episodes are standalone stories set in the wider Boys universe. Some are comedic, some are surprisingly dark, and one of them is confirmed canon by showrunner Eric Kripke. The episode called 1 + 1 = 2. It's Homelander's origin story, in the most direct sense, his first public mission, his first experience of being presented to the world as a superhero. And it's quite a bit to take in. At this point in the story, Homelander is young, late teens or early 20s, somewhere in that range. He's been in the lab his whole life, trained and tested and conditioned and prepared. He knows in the abstract what he's supposed to be. He's seen the propaganda images, sat through the projector sessions, been told he's the greatest hero alive, but he's never actually gone out and done it. Never been in a real crisis, interacting with real people, expected to perform heroism in real time for an audience that doesn't know what he actually is. The mission involves a hostage situation, and Homelander handles it the way someone handles their first driving lesson when they've only ever read about cars and been told they're a natural, with a combination of overconfidence and catastrophic gaps in practical understanding. He goes in too hard. People die who probably didn't need to. He uses his powers in ways that are effective in the sense that the immediate threat is neutralized, but devastating in the sense that there's significant collateral damage. Stillwell came in to sort it out. Stillwell, at this point, already an executive at Vought, already responsible for Homelander's management and public relations, is there to handle the aftermath. She takes the chaos of what Homelander actually did and transforms it, through the alchemy of corporate PR, into a heroic narrative. She controls the story. She adjusts the footage, manages the witness accounts, redirect the media coverage. The story that goes out to the public is Homelander saving the day. The reality, which involved a significant number of additional deaths, disappears into Vought's institutional memory, where it joins a long list of things that officially didn't happen. What's significant about this episode, beyond the events themselves, is the dynamic it establishes between Homelander and Stillwell from the very beginning. He looks to her after the mission, and there's a desperation in it, not just for approval, but for interpretation. He doesn't know how to evaluate what he just did. He needs her to tell him what it was, whether it was good or bad, a success or a failure, something to be proud of or something to hide. And she tells him it was good. She tells him he did exactly what he was supposed to do. She shapes his understanding of himself through the way she narrates his actions back to him. That's a pattern that will repeat throughout their relationship, and, in different forms, throughout his relationships with almost everyone. He's never developed the internal framework to evaluate himself. He grew up in an environment where his actions were observed and assessed by external authorities, and he's never stopped needing that external assessment. When Stillwell calls him good, he feels good. When she's disappointed, he's devastated. He has no ground of his own. And Vought, of course, built that dependency deliberately. A supe who could evaluate himself independently, who had his own values and his own moral compass and his own sense of what he was doing and why, would be much harder to control. A supe who needs someone to tell him whether he's good or bad is someone who can be managed as long as you control what they hear about themselves. The episode ends with Homelander standing in front of a crowd that's cheering for him for the first time. The real crowd, the public, people who have no idea what he is or what he just did. They're just cheering because Vought told them a hero saved the day, and Homelander stands in the middle of it, and you can see him absorbing it, really absorbing it, in a way that's visibly new. Whatever he'd been told to expect, whatever the projector sessions had tried to prepare him for, the actual experience of being adored by thousands of strangers is something categorically different. He loves it. Immediately. Completely. Viscerally. That crowd is giving him something that no amount of lab approval or Vogelbaum praise or careful Vought management ever gave him, which is the feeling of being loved by people who don't need anything from him. Strangers, at a distance, cheering for something he did. There are no strings on it, no tests, no approval being withheld as leverage, just unconditional, uncomplicated adoration. It's addictive in a way that is, if anything, more dangerous than the physical power he already has, because he'll spend the rest of his life chasing that feeling, and the crowd will keep giving it to him, and every time it's given to him, it'll feel like not quite enough, and the need for more will just keep growing. That's the story of Homelander in a sentence, honestly. The crowd. Madeline Stillwell, played by Elizabeth Shue, is in some ways the most important relationship in Homelander's story, at least until the end of season 1, when it ends in the particular way it ends, and then becomes something he's shaped by in absentia for the rest of the show. She's introduced as a senior vice president at Vought International, with primary responsibility for the Seven, their superhero team, their flagship product. She's brilliant at her job, polished, strategic, completely comfortable with the moral compromises the job requires, and possessed of a very clear-eyed understanding of what Homelander is and what he needs. She doesn't romanticize him. She doesn't fear him, or at least she doesn't let the fear show in a way that he can use. She treats him with a kind of practiced, calibrated warmth that is, on its surface, entirely professional, and underneath that surface, enormously effective as a management tool. And she manages him as a mother would manage a very powerful, very unstable child. Because that's what he is. That's the relationship dynamic he's looking for, whether he'd describe it that way or not. The show depicts this with the specifically uncomfortable recurring scene in season 1, in which Homelander nurses from Stillwell, who sits calmly and calls him her good boy while he does it. It's played straight. It's not presented as a joke. It's one of the most deliberately jarring scenes in the show, and I think it's meant to be, because it's the most efficient possible visual shorthand for his psychology. The strongest being on Earth, in a position of absolute physical infant-like dependency, with the person who makes him feel safe. If that reads as strange and sad, it is both of those things. The show is not asking you to find it funny. It's asking you to understand what it means that this is what comfort looks like for him. He was denied genuine maternal connection as a child. There was no mother, not in any real sense, and that absence has created a need so profound that it's expressed in these very literal, regressed ways with the one person who offers him something approaching it. Stillwell is not naive about what she's doing. She's using his attachment deliberately, deploying warmth as a management strategy, giving him affection in measured doses that keep him compliant and functional without giving him so much that he stops needing her. It's calculated. But here's the thing about Stillwell that the show handles carefully. She also seems to have some genuine feeling for him. Not in a romantic sense, and not in a way that overrides her professional calculation, but something that resembles real maternal protectiveness. She lies to him extensively, she manipulates him constantly, she uses him without hesitation, and she also seems to believe, on some level, that she's protecting him, that her management of him is in his interest as much as Vaught's. Whether that's self-deception or genuine care, I genuinely can't tell, and I think that ambiguity is the most interesting thing about her. Over the course of Season 1, their dynamic becomes strained as Homelander's need for control grows, and Stillwell's ability to satisfy that need, while also managing Vaught's interests, becomes increasingly difficult. He wants information she's withholding. He wants autonomy she can't give him. He can feel, with the particular sensitivity of someone who has always depended entirely on reading the people around them for survival, that she's hiding things. And she is. Specifically, she's hiding the fact that Becca Butcher, the wife of Billy Butcher, who was briefly Homelander's social media manager before a specific terrible incident, is not dead, as Homelander was told, but alive, living somewhere under Vaught's protection, with a child. The season 1 finale confrontation is one of the most quietly devastating scenes in the show. Homelander arrives at Stillwell's home, having worked out enough of the truth to know he's been deceived. There's a horrible calm to the scene. He's not shouting, he's not raging, he's very controlled in the way that he gets when something genuinely terrible is about to happen. He tells her what he knows. He asks her to fill in the rest. She does, with the careful honesty of someone who has finally run out of room to maneuver. And then he kills her, freeze-rays her, right there in her kitchen. And then, and this is the part that really lands, he cries. He holds her body and he cries because he just killed the person he loved most. The person who was his mother, as close as he'd ever had one. He killed her because she betrayed him, because the relationship was built on management and manipulation and lies, and he can't tolerate being lied to, but the killing doesn't mean he didn't love her. He absolutely did. He does. Both of those things are true at the same time. He'll have a version of Stillwell in his head for the rest of the show, hallucinations of her appearing at moments of stress or uncertainty, offering him the praise and reassurance that her actual physical presence can no longer provide, which is, if anything, sadder than the killing. He misses her. He replaced her with an internal projection. The wound never really closes. And if you want to understand why Homelander forms the relationships he does in subsequent seasons, why he gravitates towards certain people, why he reacts to rejection the way he does, why the need for love and the impulse to destroy what he loves seem to operate in him at the same frequency, Stillwell is the root of a lot of it. One of the things that Season 1 does really well is that it shows you the performance before it shows you what's underneath. For most of the first few episodes, Homelander is presented almost exactly as the public sees him. Charming, confident, heroic, slightly self-deprecating in the way of someone who knows they're brilliant but has been coached on not making it too obvious. The cape, the smile, the press appearances, the endorsements. He's absolutely magnetic to watch. And Anthony Starr plays the public-facing version of the character with such ease and commitment that you spend the first episode or two slightly uncertain whether the show is actually going to complicate him. It does, obviously. Fairly quickly, the cracks start showing early. A moment of extraordinary pettiness here, a flash of violence there, a look behind the eyes that doesn't match the smile. And gradually, across 8 episodes, the season does the work of letting you see what's underneath the performance. Publicly, in the world of the show, Homelander is America's greatest hero. The 7 are positioned similarly to how the Avengers operate in the MCU, except that their heroic exploits are heavily curated, partially fictional, and always managed with Vaught's financial and political interests in mind. They do press junkets, they have sponsors, they film commercials, there's a 7 tower with a gift shop, there are 7 branded everything. Homelander is the face of all of it, the most recognizable, most powerful, most beloved member of the team, which gives him enormous leverage with Vought and even more enormous ego. His actual relationships within the 7 in Season 1 are a masterclass in how power warps every dynamic around it. Queen Maeve, his co-leader, the most senior member of the team after him, has a history with him that the show gestures at but doesn't fully explore in Season 1. She's clearly exhausted by him. She manages him with a kind of resigned wariness, picking her battles, not quite willing to confront him directly, and not quite willing to fully capitulate to him either. The Deep, who is a kind of grotesque parody of Aquaman, is terrified of Homelander in a way he tries to disguise as respect. A-Train, the speed-based member of the team, is competitive with him in the way that the second most powerful person in any room is always competitive with the first. Translucent is there. Black Noir is there, silent and masked and mysterious in ways that Season 3 will eventually explain in a devastating reveal. What Homelander does in his relationships within the 7 is particularly interesting in Season 1 because he's still somewhat constrained by Stillwell's management. He can't fully do whatever he wants because there are still structures around him, PR considerations, contractual obligations, Vaught's oversight. When Stan Edgar, the CEO, dismisses him, he can't simply vaporize Edgar because Edgar runs the company, and the company runs Homelander's entire public existence. So he fumes, he schemes, he looks for leverage in the spaces he's allowed to operate. The specific Season 1 arc that most reveals his character, apart from Stillwell, is the Billy Butcher thread. Butcher, played by Carl Urban with magnificent controlled fury, is a former SAS operative whose wife, Becca, disappeared after being assigned as Homelander's social media manager. Butcher has been convinced for years that Homelander killed her. He's built his entire life around destroying Homelander in revenge. And when Homelander encounters him, there's a recognition, the way 2 very particular kinds of person sometimes recognize each other on sight. Homelander is fascinated by Butcher, not just threatened by him, fascinated. There's something about Butcher's refusal to be impressed by him, his flat contempt, his absolute conviction that Homelander keeps returning to. He can't quite dismiss him the way he dismisses most people. Butcher sees through him in a way that simultaneously infuriates Homelander and gets under his skin. And meanwhile, the question of what actually happened to Becca is a live thread running through the season. We'll cover that properly in the section on Becca and Ryan, but the short version, for Season 1 purposes, is Becca is not dead. Homelander didn't kill her. What actually happened is much more complicated and much more damning. The season ends with the Stillwell confrontation, with Homelander discovering Becca is alive and has a child, and with him flying alone above the clouds, just him in the sky, no one watching, no performance required. Looking simultaneously free and completely lost, it's a good image. Someone who can go anywhere, who is limited by absolutely nothing physical, and who has no idea where to go or who to be when no one's looking. There's one scene in Season 1 that I think about more than any other, when it comes to understanding what Homelander actually is at his core. It's not the Stillwell scene. It's not the first time he uses the laser vision on someone. It's the plane. Here's what happens. Homelander and Queen Maeve respond to a hijacking on a commercial aircraft. They get on board, they deal with the hijackers. That part goes relatively smoothly. But one of the hijackers, in the process of being taken down, shoots the pilot. And in the chaos, the cockpit controls are destroyed beyond repair. The plane is going down. There's no way to fly it to safety. There are passengers on board, children on board. Maeve turns to Homelander and starts listing options. He could carry passengers out one by one and get them to the ground. He could try to slow the aircraft. He could do something. He's the most powerful being on Earth. Surely something is possible. He decides nothing is possible, or rather, and this is the distinction that matters, he decides that the risk of being seen to fail is greater than the cost of letting everyone die. If he tries to save people and doesn't manage to save all of them, that's a bad story for Vought. A hero who partially succeeds is a much messier narrative than a hero who tragically arrived too late. And Vought can bury the too late story. They can make it about the hijackers, about the failure of airport security, about anything except what Homelander chose to do. So he leaves. He tells Maeve to leave. She begs him to try. He threatens, in one of the show's most genuinely chilling moments, to laser every single person on that plane if she doesn't stop arguing with him and come with him right now. And they fly away. And everyone on the plane dies and Vought buries it. A cover story goes out. The footage is managed. Maeve spends years haunted by what happened on that plane, by the faces of the people who looked out the window and saw two superheroes flying away from them, and it hollows something out in her that never quite refills. Homelander, as far as we can tell, essentially moves on. The reason this scene matters so much is that it's the cleanest possible illustration of his actual moral framework. He's not evil in the comic book sense. He doesn't want people to suffer for the sake of it. He just genuinely does not care whether they suffer. The passengers on that plane are not real to him in any meaningful sense. They're the public. They're the audience. They serve a function. They applaud. When they need something from him that costs him anything at all, including the risk of looking fallible, they lose their relevance entirely. This is what's underneath the hero performance, not a different set of values, not a secret good self that occasionally gets overwhelmed by darker impulses, just nothing where the caring should be. A complete absence of the thing that makes heroism meaningful. Maeve is the character who absorbs the horror of that absence most fully. She was a genuine hero once, or at least had the potential to be. Spending years in proximity to Homelander, complicit in the cover-up of the plane and other things like it, does something irreversible to her. She becomes a sort of cautionary tale about what it costs to compromise yourself over and over in service of something that requires you to keep pretending. The plane scene is, in a quiet way, the scene that the rest of the show is about. The whole project of the boys, Butcher's vendetta, Starlight's disillusionment, Maeve's arc, all of it, is in some sense a response to what was demonstrated on that plane. That the people who are supposed to protect you will choose their own interests every time. That the performance of heroism is not the same thing as heroism. That the costume and the smile and the PR campaign do not tell you anything true about the person inside them. It's a message the show returns to in various forms, across every season. And it starts with that plane. To understand the Becca situation, you need to understand Billy Butcher, because Becca is the reason Butcher exists as the person he is, and Butcher is one of the most important people in Homelander's story, not because they like each other, but because their mutual hatred is one of the few genuine emotional realities in Homelander's life. Billy Butcher met Becca Butcher, fell in love, married her. She was, by all accounts from everyone who knew her, a genuinely good person, warm, intelligent, funny, with a real ethical core. She was assigned as Homelander's social media manager at some point, which meant she spent time around him professionally, and at some point during that proximity, Homelander assaulted her. The show is clear that this was not a relationship or an affair. It was assault, full stop. Becca went to Vought for help afterward, and Vought, recognizing almost immediately that she was pregnant, and that this pregnancy was historically unprecedented because it was the first known case of a natural-born supe, made a decision. They told Homelander she was dead. They told Billy she was dead, and they moved her to a secret facility where she lived under Vought's supervision with her son. Homelander didn't know Ryan existed for years. He believed Vogelbaum's account that Becca had died in childbirth, that the baby had died with her. He had no reason to question it. The discovery at the end of season 1 that this was a lie, that Becca was alive, that there was a child, hits him in a complicated way. There's something genuinely interesting in his response, which isn't pure calculation. He wants Ryan. He wants him in a way that seems, on the surface, almost desperately human. Not because Ryan is useful to Vought, not because he's a strategic asset, because Ryan is his, literally his blood, his continuation, someone who came from him. After a lifetime of having no one, Homelander has a son. Season 2 is where the Becca and Ryan arc runs properly. Homelander finds them in their little compound, their artificially normal life. Becca is doing everything she can to raise Ryan as a good person, a kind, curious, empathetic child who doesn't know anything about who his father really is. Homelander tries to insert himself into their lives, and the contrast between what he is and what Becca has tried to create for Ryan is painful to watch. He doesn't know how to be a parent. More specifically, he doesn't know how to be present with a child without it being about control or performance or outcomes. He can't just sit with Ryan and build something because he has no template for that. His idea of parenting involves throwing Ryan off a roof to see if his powers emerge, which is, as you might imagine, not received well by anyone, including Ryan, who is seriously injured before his healing factor kicks in. The look on Becca's face in that scene is worth noting. It's not just horror, it's a very specific recognition of exactly what she knew Homelander was and exactly why she'd been trying to protect Ryan from him. The Season 2 arc resolves in the worst possible way for everyone. Stormfront, Homelander's new partner, the Nazi supe who showed up as the newest member of the Seven, goes after Becca in the woods, trying to kill Ryan as part of her own agenda. Ryan's powers emerge for the first time in a meaningful way when he uses his heat vision to protect his mother. He destroys Stormfront, but in the process, accidentally, catastrophically, he hits Becca. The injuries are fatal. She dies there in the woods with Ryan holding her. Ryan is 8 years old. He kills his mother trying to save her. That's the weight he carries going forward. And Homelander is left with Ryan in the immediate aftermath as the only parent still standing. Butcher arrives. There's a confrontation, and Ryan in the moment chooses to go with Butcher rather than Homelander, a choice that lands on Homelander with visible devastation, though he can't fully show it because showing devastation means showing weakness, which is something his conditioning makes almost impossible. Butcher takes Ryan to Grace Mallory, Deputy Director of the CIA, to keep him safe. And that arrangement, Ryan in CIA protection, Butcher trying to look after him at a distance, Homelander wanting him back, becomes one of the central tensions of seasons 3 and 4. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The thing I keep coming back to about the Becca arc is that Homelander's attachment to Ryan is, as far as I can tell, the most genuine thing about him. He doesn't love people well, he's never learned how, but he loves Ryan in whatever way he's capable of, which makes it both more tragic and more complicated, because his love is also possessive and controlling and frequently harmful, and Ryan needs protection from it, at least as much as he needs it. The question of what's best for Ryan, and who gets to decide that, and whether a father who genuinely loves you but has no idea how to love you safely can be called a good parent. Those are questions the show turns over and over without settling them. Which feels right? There's no clean answer. Season 2 of The Boys brings in a new character who shakes up every dynamic on the show and does something to Homelander specifically that almost nothing else in the story manages to do. She gets under his skin in a way that looks, at least initially, remarkably like falling in love. Stormfront, played by Aya Cash, who does extraordinary work with a character who is operating on about 6 different levels simultaneously. She arrives as a new member of the Seven, recruited by Vought without Homelander's knowledge or approval, and her entrance is deliberately designed to upend his authority. She livestreams their first meeting on Instagram while he's trying to maintain control of the narrative. She's unbothered by his seniority. She treats him with a casualness that comes, we eventually understand, from someone who has lived long enough not to be impressed by anyone. Because Stormfront is very old, born in the early 20th century, a genuine historical Nazi, she was married to Frederick Vought himself, the company's founder, who administered Compound 5 to her and gave her powers and, apparently, a shared ideological vision that has not aged well, to put it extremely mildly. She's been operating under various names for decades. The Liberty persona, a southern superhero from the 1970s and 80s, who turns out to have murdered a black man named Myron Hunter and was quietly retired from public life when that became a liability, is one of them. She arrives in Season 2 with an agenda: to use Homelander as the centerpiece of a white nationalist movement that she's been building through social media, positioning him as the pinnacle of Aryan supremacy. The ideological framework is her late husband's, the idea that supes represent the superior race and should rule over regular humans, and she's been patient about executing it for a very long time. The thing is, Homelander doesn't really engage with the ideology at that level. He doesn't think of himself in racial terms, he thinks of himself as uniquely Homelander, a category of one that is superior to everyone else, regardless of anything as mundane as race. He finds Stormfront's framing a bit reductive, which is darkly funny given that the conclusion he draws is, "I'm better than all of them," which is more or less the same conclusion, just narcissistically personalised, but he's drawn to her for other reasons. She does something Stillwell was too professional to do, and something no one else in his life has ever done. She tells him the truth. Not the managed, PR-approved, strategically calibrated truth that Stillwell told him, but a more raw, confrontational, genuinely opinionated truth. She pushes back on him. She disagrees with him. She's not afraid of him. And paradoxically, that non-fear is the most attractive thing she could possibly offer, because everyone else has always been afraid of him, and he's always been able to sense it, and it's always felt hollow in the way that coerced approval always does. Someone who can tell him no without flinching is, for Homelander, the rarest thing on earth. He mistakes that quality for being seen, for someone finally understanding him. And to some extent, it is those things, but it's also Stormfront having spent a century cultivating the specific skills required to manage very powerful men without showing the management. Their relationship becomes romantic over the course of Season 2, which is played with the full discomfort the show intends. He seems happy in a way he hasn't been since Stillwell died, which makes the eventual collapse of it more brutal. The collapse comes from Ryan. Stormfront goes after Ryan and Becca in the woods, her own agenda overriding her relationship management instincts. Ryan's powers emerge in response, and he destroys her in a way that is genuinely one of the most visually shocking moments in the show. She survives, but barely, and is hospitalized in a state that is described charitably as severe and lasting. She eventually dies in custody, apparently by hunger strike, in the period between Seasons 2 and 3. Homelander's public response to the Stormfront situation is one of his most polished performances. He distances himself from her, reinstates Starlight, Annie January, who'd been sidelined, gives a statement that positions him as a reasonable figure who didn't know the truth about his partner. He's practiced at covering things. The machinery works. The private response is the Season 2 finale, which ends with Homelander alone at the top of the Chrysler Building, having publicly managed everything, having won by conventional metrics, pantless, talking to himself, repeating, "I can do whatever I want," until it starts to sound less like a boast and more like someone trying to convince themselves of something. It's one of the most effective scenes in the show's run, I think, because it's not played as victory or defeat. It's played as the particular hollow quality of someone who has everything and still feels nothing. The relationship is gone. Stillwell is still dead. Ryan chose Butcher. Stormfront is destroyed. And he's standing on top of the most famous building in New York, completely alone, telling himself he's fine. He's not fine. Season 3 is, in my opinion, the season where Homelander's character work is most interesting, because it does something genuinely surprising. It gives him a father. Soldier Boy, Benjamin, played by Jensen Ackles with exactly the kind of grizzled American machismo the character requires, is introduced in Season 3 as a legend recovered from history. He was America's first superhero, active from World War II onward, beloved by the public and terrible to virtually everyone he actually knew. He was, in the show's telling, an abusive, narcissistic, casually cruel person who treated the members of his superhero team, Payback, with contempt and regularly made their lives miserable. His team eventually arranged to have him handed to the Soviets during a mission in Nicaragua in 1984, where he was captured, subjected to experiments, and ultimately put into cryogenic storage. Still alive, preserved, a problem kept on ice for decades. Season 3's Boy's plot involves trying to find and deploy Soldier Boy as a weapon against Homelander, because he's one of the very few entities in the world that can actually hurt him. But while that's happening, we get the reveal. Soldier Boy calls Homelander and tells him that in 1980 he donated to a sperm bank in a lab, and a year later a baby was born, and that baby was Homelander. Homelander's reaction to this news is worth dwelling on. He goes to verify it, he confirms it, and then he holds onto it with both hands, the way someone grabs a life preserver after spending their entire life drowning. He has a father, an actual biological father, a living person he came from, someone who, unlike the surrogate mother who died in the delivery room, or Vogelbaum, who shaped him like clay, exists and is reachable, and is also, as it happens, a superhero. The fantasy he builds around it is immediate and visible. He and Soldier Boy together, father and son, unstoppable, a real family, no more of this alone business. And then he brings Ryan into the picture. Grandfather, father, son. 3 generations. An actual family. Something that looks from a certain angle almost normal. He presents this to Soldier Boy at Vought Tower in front of Butcher and Maeve. And Soldier Boy looks at him and calls him a disappointment, weak, damaged, attention-seeking. He says he wishes he could have raised him to be better, but that it's too late. And the implication is that Homelander isn't worth the effort. Then he grabs Homelander by the throat. The rejection is total. And the way Anthony Starr plays that moment, the way the fantasy on his face just dissolves, the particular look of a very powerful person, discovering they're still, after everything, deeply unworthy of the love they're asking for, is genuinely affecting. Even knowing what he is, even knowing everything he's done. That moment lands because we've been watching, across 3 seasons, what the absence of parental love has done to this person, and here's the one person who could have given it to him telling him he's not worth giving it to. He turns against Soldier Boy in that same confrontation. When Soldier Boy strikes Ryan, there's a moment, brief, unmistakable, where Homelander's priorities are simply and clearly parental. His son is hurt, he moves toward his son. The family dream, the father, all of it becomes irrelevant in the face of that specific instinct. He turns his heat vision on Soldier Boy and drives him back. Soldier Boy ends the season not dead, put back in cryogenic storage, but not killed, which is a deliberate choice by the writers. He'll be back in season 5. There's more of that story to tell. The season 3 finale ends with the crowd scene, which I think is the single most important moment in the whole show for understanding where Homelander's story is going. He introduces Ryan at a rally, a public event with supporters, with press, with the whole apparatus of Homelander's public persona on display. A person in the crowd, supporting Starlight, throws a soft drink can. It hits Ryan in the face. Homelander doesn't hesitate. He vaporizes the man on the spot. Laser vision, public in front of thousands of people. There's a silence, and then the crowd starts to applaud. And Homelander's face, the sequence that Star plays across about 3 seconds, is extraordinary. Goes through shock, then recognition, then something that looks almost like relief, and then something that looks like hunger. He's discovered quite suddenly that the rules he thought applied to him don't apply at all. He's discovered that the crowd will cheer for anything if he does it with enough confidence. He's discovered that there is no bottom, no line, no moment at which the public says enough, because the public that's there is his public, and his public doesn't have a bottom. He smiles eventually, and you can see in that smile the shape of everything that happens in Season 4. Season 4 begins with a Homelander on trial. Actual criminal charges, actual courtroom, actual legal proceedings for the murder he committed at the end of Season 3, the man in the crowd. And the first thing the season establishes is that this is not going to go the way legal proceedings are supposed to go, because Homelander's supporters have essentially converted his prosecution into a cultural flashpoint, and the system is not well equipped to handle a defendant whose fan base is willing to physically threaten anyone who cooperates with the prosecution. He's acquitted. Of course he's acquitted. And then to celebrate, he orders several of his fans, 3 of them, in a sequence that the show plays with a kind of horrible normalcy, to attack counter-protesters in the crowd outside the courthouse. People die. Homelander watches. He's done this before, in a sense, letting the violence happen around him while maintaining enough distance to deny direct culpability. But the deliberateness of it here is new. This isn't losing his temper. This is decision-making. Season 4 is the season of Sister Sage, and she's a genuinely interesting addition to the show's roster. Played by Susan Hayward, Sage is described as the smartest person in the world. Not a hyperbole, but a literal claim within the show's logic, and Homelander recruits her to help him transform from a powerful soup celebrity into something more durable and structural. He's not trying to be famous anymore. He's trying to be entrenched. There's a difference. What Sage does, and it's elegant even if it's horrifying, is help him understand that raw power is not sufficient for lasting control. You can be the strongest person alive and still have your power contingent on public approval, corporate support, legal structures. All of those things can be undermined or shifted or simply withdrawn. What Homelander needs, Sage determines, is to convert power into institutional authority, to make himself not just powerful, but legitimate, or at least to make his authority appear legitimate to enough people that resistance becomes difficult to organize. The strategy she architects involves dividing the public into 2 camps, Homelander's supporters and everyone else, and making that division so intense and so identity-based that the Homelander camp becomes self-policing. They don't need him to manage them. They manage themselves, because opposition to Homelander has been framed as opposition to everything they value about themselves. It's a very specific kind of political engineering, and the show is not subtle about what it's drawing from. The political machinery culminates in the Season 4 finale, when Homelander and Sage have maneuvered a puppet, former Speaker of the House Stephen Calhoun, an entirely ordinary politician who's been placed in a position he didn't particularly want, into declaring martial law. Calhoun stands up and announces it, and then Homelander steps forward and effectively takes over the announcement, making it clear that Calhoun is not in charge and has never been in charge and is essentially a prop in a production Homelander is directing. He is now, for all practical purposes, the most powerful person in the United States, in both the physical and the political sense simultaneously. There's no longer any significant external check on him. The company no longer runs him. The government no longer constrains him. The public, his public, approves. Meanwhile, the Ryan subplot in Season 4 is doing something quietly devastating that's easy to miss in the noise of the political arc. Ryan has been living at Vought Tower with Homelander, ostensibly happy, the father-son relationship seemingly functional. But there are signs a choreographer accidentally hurt and Ryan not adequately concerned about it. Small cruelties that Homelander rewards with approval, a general trend of the moral compass pointing slightly further from north each episode. The season finale brings it to a head. Butcher and Grace Mallory try to bring Ryan in. They want to train him, use his powers against Homelander, give him purpose beyond his father. They're not wrong about the strategic necessity. They're wrong about the approach. Ryan feels, reasonably enough, like he's being treated as a tool rather than a person. And when Mallory tries to physically prevent him from leaving, he shoves her hard, and she dies from the impact. He didn't mean to kill her. Earlier, Ryan, the one who felt guilty about every accidental hurt, would be destroyed by this. This Ryan stares down at her body and then looks at Butcher and walks away. He doesn't go to Homelander immediately. He's not there yet. But the absence of remorse is the thing that signals where the arc is heading. The mid-credits scene of the Season 4 finale shows Homelander being taken to a storage pod. Inside the pod, Soldier Boy, still alive, still preserved. The implication for Season 5 is clear. The father who rejected him is back, and Homelander's face looking at that pod is impossible to fully read. There's something in it that might be anticipation, and something that might be dread, and something that might be both at once. Season 4 ends with the boys scattered, captured, or on the run. Homelander fully in control of the country's government machinery. Ryan somewhere out in the world, increasingly his father's son. And the stage set for a final season that Kripke has described as the show's version of the apocalypse. I want to step back from the plot for a bit and spend some time just thinking about Homelander. Not what he does, but what's driving it. Because I think the character is more coherent than he sometimes appears, and the coherence is what makes him genuinely interesting rather than just an effective villain. The most common clinical framework that fans and critics have applied to him is borderline personality disorder, or something adjacent to it. I want to be careful here. I'm not a psychologist. The show's writers haven't explicitly confirmed a specific diagnosis, and applying clinical labels to fictional characters is always a bit reductive. But the pattern that gets described in BPD literature, what's sometimes called the idealize/devalue cycle, the intense fear of abandonment, the unstable sense of self that requires constant external validation to feel real, maps onto Homelander's behaviour across all 4 seasons with a remarkable consistency. Think about the major relationships in his life. Stillwell, intensely idealised, experienced as the only real safety, killed the moment he felt genuinely betrayed. Stormfront, adored initially because she treated him like a peer rather than a subordinate. Relationship collapsed when her priorities conflicted with his son. Soldier Boy, a fantasy built in days, an entire imaginary future constructed around a person he'd just met because that person was biologically his. Immediately devastated when the fantasy didn't materialise. These aren't random, they follow a structure. The thing that sits underneath all of it, though, is something the show identifies with unusual clarity. He cannot regulate himself. He has no stable internal sense of who he is that exists independently of how other people are responding to him. When people love him, he feels real. When people criticise him, he experiences it as an attack on his very existence. The rage that criticism produces in him is not proportionate to the actual threat, because it's not responding to the actual threat. It's responding to the annihilation of the only thing making him feel like a real person. Eric Kripke, in various interviews, has talked about Homelander's arc across the series in terms of a very specific dynamic. The more power he accrues, the less happy he becomes. That's the engine of everything. Power is the tool he uses to pursue the thing he actually wants, which is love. But power, in his particular case, poisons the possibility of love. You cannot coerce someone into genuinely loving you. You cannot threaten someone into truly admiring you. Every person around him is either afraid of him or performing affection, because they have to, and he can feel the difference. He's always been able to feel the difference, and it never gets better, no matter how much more powerful he becomes. There's also the loneliness, which I think the show handles more thoughtfully than most superhero narratives manage. He is, as far as we know, the only person in the world who is exactly what he is. There's no one who can understand his experience from the inside. He can't have a friendship with a normal person because the power imbalance is absolute. He can't have a relationship with another supe without hierarchy getting in the way. He exists in a category of one, and that isolation is total. The hallucinations of Stillwell, which run from season 2 onward, appearing during moments of stress or uncertainty, are one of the show's most economical psychological characterization tools. He's created an internal mother figure to compensate for the external one he lost. She appears when he needs guidance or validation. She tells him he's good, he's doing well, he's making the right choices. She's not real. He knows she's not real, and she's not enough. The crowd is what he reaches for instead. That feeling from his very first public appearance, strangers cheering for him from a distance, with no strings attached. Of course, the crowd isn't enough either. What the show never resolves, and I think it's right not to, is the question of whether Homelander could have been different. Vogelbaum thinks so. He believes there was something genuine in the child that he chose to destroy, and he carries that guilt. The show seems to agree that there was something there early on, the sweet 5-year-old, the child who liked stories about Davy Crockett, and that it was deliberately destroyed by a system that needed a weapon instead of a person. But the destruction is thorough, and by the time we meet him, the question of what might have been is more theoretical than practical. The man he is was made over 20 years. He's 50 years of age in the show, more or less. A lifetime of this. Ryan complicates the question. Ryan has his genetics and grew up differently, and for a while he seemed to offer an answer. The nature isn't the problem, the nurture was, but season 4's Ryan gradually darkening under the pressure of his circumstances and his father's influence suggests the answer is less clean than that. The conditioning matters, the love matters, but the power, and what power does to the people around someone who has it, that matters too. And that's not something Becca could fully protect Ryan from forever. I don't know that Homelander had to become what he became. I think it's possible to believe he was not inevitably a monster, that with different circumstances, he could have been something else. I also think that's cold comfort for everyone he's actually hurt. Both of those things coexist. Ryan Butcher, or Ryan, as the show generally calls him, without settling firmly on either surname, is one of the more quietly important threads in the whole series. He's Homelander's son, same genetics, same powers, raised by Becca in a small Vought compound with as much love and warmth and ordinary care as she could manage. A genuinely sweet kid, curious, empathetic, the sort of child who apologized when he accidentally hurt people. And then things started going wrong. Season 3 is where it begins. Ryan killing Becca, even accidentally, is the first rupture. Then his relationship with Butcher deteriorates. When Butcher, who is carrying his own damage and his own limitations around Ryan, distances himself at exactly the wrong moment. And into that gap steps Homelander, with a hug and an "I'll always love you," and the particular appeal of someone who is powerful and confident and present when no one else is. By the end of season 3, Ryan has chosen Homelander, freely, as far as free choices go in context shaped entirely by grief and longing and abandonment. Season 4, Ryan is the result of a year of Homelander's parenting, which mostly seems to involve rewarding toughness, rewarding the suppression of guilt, rewarding the expression of contempt for people who are weaker. Ryan makes small choices that go wrong, a choreographer accidentally hurt, and where earlier Ryan would have been consumed by guilt. Season 4, Ryan feels guilty, but manages it. Then gradually, feels guilty, but manages it faster. Then by the end, feels guilty noticeably less. The killing of Grace Mallory is the culmination of this arc in Season 4, and the thing that makes it devastating is the absence of remorse. Not the act itself. Ryan didn't mean to hurt her. He was trying to leave, and she was trying to stop him. It was an accident, in a literal sense. The act, Becca's death, was also an accident in a literal sense, but Ryan's response to it is categorically different from how he responded when Becca died. He doesn't cry, he doesn't freeze. He looks at Butcher, and he leaves. The show is careful not to make Ryan into a villain outright. He's not that yet, if he becomes that at all. He's a teenager who has had a genuinely awful couple of years and made some bad choices and is being shaped by the worst possible influence. There's still something retrievable there. The question the final season is presumably wrestling with is whether anyone manages to retrieve it. The specific parallel that the show draws in Season 5 is the Star Wars one, which it makes explicit. Butcher tells Ryan he's Luke Skywalker, Homelander is Darth Vader, and Ryan is the only one who has a real shot at getting through to him. The parallel is pointed enough that it's clearly intentional. The father who is twisted by dark forces, the son who might save him or be consumed by the same forces. The question of whether love across that much damage and that much history can accomplish anything. Whether the show goes for the redemption version of that story or the tragic version, I genuinely don't know. Kripke has been cagey about it, as you'd expect from someone running a final season. But the Ryan arc feels to me like one of the things the show has been building toward from early on. The first natural-born Supe, the son who might save his father or become him, the child who carries both Becca's empathy and Homelander's genetics, raised first with love and then with its absence, trying to figure out who he is with almost no stable ground to stand on. What I find most interesting about Ryan in the end is what he represents for the show's central question about supes. Homelander is proof that power without love produces monsters. Becca's Ryan was proof that love could counteract that. Season 4, Ryan is proof that the counteraction isn't permanent, that the environment keeps working on you, that love is necessary but not sufficient if it's absent for long enough and replaced with something else. It's a fairly bleak conclusion if you sit with it, but the show earns it. Season 5 is the final season of The Boys, confirmed as such by Eric Kripke, who has said he always planned the story as a 5-season arc. It's airing right now. As of recording this, we're a few episodes in, and I'll be covering it here based on what's publicly known without going too deep into specific episode spoilers for the later episodes. If you're completely up to date and want to discuss where it's going, there are plenty of more spoiler-heavy videos out there for that. Tonight we're just taking it nice and easy. Where we are at the start of Season 5, Homelander has the government. He has martial law. He has a puppet president in Stephen Calhoun who announces things and steps back while Homelander does the actual talking. He has hundreds of superheroes nationwide deputized to report directly to him. He has, for the first time in his life, a structure that matches the scale of his ego. He is, in a practical sense, in charge of the United States. And he's still not happy, which, as Kripke has been saying in interviews, and which the show illustrates with painful clarity, is the point. Power is not what he wanted. Power is just the thing he kept reaching for instead of what he actually wanted, which is something power can't give him. Season 5 introduces the God Complex arc, which is the logical extension of everything we've seen before. In Season 3, Homelander said privately, in a moment of quiet blasphemy, "The only man in the sky is me." In Season 5, that's no longer a private thought. It's becoming a public theology. He's developing something called the Democratic Church of America, with the help of a new character, O Father, played by Daveed Diggs, and positioning himself not just as the most powerful man in America, but as something approaching a deity. His private hallucinations of Madeline Stillwell are now encouraging him to ascend further. Why should Jesus have more love than you? The thing about the God complex arc that's genuinely interesting is that it's not a departure from who he's always been, it's the destination. Everything from the lab forward has been building to this. He was conditioned to see himself as the pinnacle of human achievement, the embodiment of American greatness, the ultimate product of Vought's vision. The logical endpoint of that conditioning, left to develop for 50 years in a man with infinite physical power and no external check on his behavior, is exactly this: the belief that he is not just better than other people, but categorically different from them. Not human in the way they are, something else. What he's actually building is a mechanism of control that makes his position stable regardless of who's in government or what the news cycle is doing. Religion is the most durable form of social control ever devised, and he's smart enough, or rather, Sage was smart enough, and he's smart enough to use her insights to recognize that. You can vote out a politician, you can impeach a president. Deposing a god requires a different kind of effort. Meanwhile, Soldier Boy is back. The mid-credits scene of Season 4 established that he's alive and being kept in a pod that the puppet president is now aware of. Season 5 picks up that thread, and based on what's been discussed in interviews, the Homelander Soldier Boy dynamic is going to get significant screen time in the final season. Kripke has said there's a lot of good father-son emotion between them that we never really got a chance to play, which sounds like the show intends to give Homelander and Soldier Boy actual time together, rather than the brief explosive confrontation of Season 3. What that looks like, I'm curious to see. On the other side, the boys are scattered. Butcher has a soup-killing virus, which is morally catastrophic as a solution, because it would kill innocent supes alongside Homelander. Starlight is building a resistance. Huey and Mother's Milk and Kimiko and Frenchie are navigating a world that is genuinely under Homelander's control in ways it wasn't in previous seasons. Ryan is somewhere out there, not firmly on anyone's side. What the final season seems to be asking, and what I think the whole show has been asking in various forms, is whether there's a way out of this that doesn't require becoming as monstrous as the thing you're fighting. Butcher's virus would work. Butcher's virus would also kill people who don't deserve to die. The moral cost of defeating Homelander by the most efficient means available is not trivial, and the show has always been interested in that kind of moral cost. I'm not going to speculate too much about where it ends, partly because I genuinely don't know, and partly because the speculation videos are not what tonight is for. What I'll say is that the architecture of the story points towards some kind of reckoning between Homelander and Ryan, whether that's a confrontation, a reconciliation, a tragedy, some combination, because the show has spent 4 seasons setting it up. And the father-son dynamic with Soldier Boy adds another layer to that, because Homelander's relationship with his own father is unfinished business that shapes everything about how he relates to Ryan. It's a good final season setup, honestly. High stakes, clear character arcs, genuine uncertainty about outcomes. Kripke has been saying for a while that he knows exactly how the story ends, down to the final scene. I believe him, and I'm quite interested to see whether it lands the way it seems like it should. I want to spend a bit of time on Anthony Starr, because I think the performance is so central to why this character works, that it deserves its own conversation. You could write Homelander exactly as written and have a mediocre villain. What Starr does with the material is something quite different. Starr is a New Zealand actor from Auckland, for anyone keeping track of these things. Before The Boys, he was probably best known internationally for Banshee, an American crime drama that ran from 2013 to 2016, where he played a con man who takes over the identity of a small-town sheriff. If you've seen Banshee, you understand immediately why he was cast as Homelander. There's something in his particular set of skills, the ability to project absolute physical confidence while conveying enormous internal chaos the specific way he can be charming and threatening in the same moment that makes him uniquely suited to this kind of character. Banshee is quite violent and quite good, and not particularly well remembered, which is a shame, but it works as a catalogue of everything Star can do. The specific technical things that Star does with Homelander that I find most impressive. The smile first. Homelander's smile is one of the more unsettling things I've seen on television, and it's entirely in the performance. It's too perfect. It arrives slightly too quickly and stays slightly too long, and there's a precision to it that reads as practiced rather than spontaneous. Real smiles have a raggedness to them. They spread unevenly, they land asymmetrically, they involve the whole face. Homelander's smile is controlled in a way that makes it feel mechanical, even when it's intended to be sincere. Star has clearly thought very carefully about how to do this, because it's consistent across 5 seasons. You can always tell a Homelander smile from a John smile, and there are very few John smiles. The eyes related to the smile. Star has this ability to hold eye contact in a way that's extremely uncomfortable for the other person in the scene, and by extension, for the viewer. Not an aggressive stare, just sustained attention that lasts a beat longer than social convention allows, in a way that says, I could do anything to you, and I haven't decided yet whether I will. It's extremely effective and looks like it would be genuinely difficult to do repeatedly for hours on a film set. The vulnerability, which is the hardest part. Homelander needs to be threatening and pitiable in roughly equal measure, and those are not easy to hold simultaneously. Star manages it by making the vulnerability physical in a very specific way. When Homelander is genuinely distressed, not performing distress, but genuinely destabilized, he gets smaller. Not literally, but posturally. The shoulders drop slightly, the chin comes down, something around the eyes changes. It's the body language of the child. He still is somewhere underneath everything, surfacing in moments when the performance cracks. It's very subtle, and it's always there if you're looking for it. The comedy, too, deserves credit. Homelander is sometimes genuinely funny, not in ways that undercut the threat, but in the way that very confident people can be funny because they say things out loud that social norms would prevent anyone else from saying. Star plays those moments with perfect deadpan and never seems to be trying to be funny, which is how those moments work. He's been recognised for the performance, Golden Globe nominations, Screen Actors Guild attention, but the Emmy situation has been, to be diplomatic about it, historically perplexing. He's been nominated but hasn't won, in years when I think a reasonable argument could be made that the performance was the best in the category. It's the kind of thing that happens when a show's perceived as being in a genre, superhero, prestige TV adjacent, genre fiction, that awards bodies don't always know how to evaluate. For what it's worth, Kripke has been effusive about him in interviews. Multiple cast members have said that shooting scenes with Star, particularly in the later seasons, is a particular kind of experience that they don't have with other actors. Something about the unpredictability of what he'll do in a scene, even with the script in front of everyone, that keeps scenes feeling live in a way that's unusual on a high production value television set. There's an interview somewhere, I'll link it in the description if I can find it, where Star talks about finding empathy for Homelander as the only way to play the character without it tipping into camp. He doesn't perform villainy, he performs a person who has been made into something terrible and is operating as that person, without self-awareness about the gap between what he believes about himself and what he actually is. The performance is grounded in that tragedy, and I think that's what makes it something more than an impressive villain turn. It's a genuinely compassionate performance of an uncompassionate person, and that's quite rare. I've been talking mostly about Homelander in isolation, but I think it's worth spending some time on the people he surrounds himself with, because the way he relates to the other members of the Seven tells you a lot about him that you don't get from the more dramatic plot moments. Queen Maeve is the most interesting one, to my mind. She and Homelander have history that predates the show. They were together, romantically, at some point in the past, and the relationship ended badly, in ways the show doesn't fully detail, but implies were consistent with everything we know about how Homelander's relationships go. By the time Season 1 starts, they're operating as co-leaders of the Seven in a dynamic that is more like two people who have settled into a functional working arrangement after surviving something together than anything resembling warmth. Maeve, played by Dominique McElligott, is one of the show's more quietly devastating portraits of what happens to someone who compromises themselves over and over in service of something that doesn't deserve it. She was a genuine idealist once. She wanted to be a real hero in the actual meaning of the word, and she ended up covering up a plane load of dead passengers because Homelander told her to, and then spending years carrying that, and the carrying of it hollowed her out in ways that eventually left her barely functional. Her arc across seasons 1 through 3 is the arc of someone slowly, painfully deciding to stop compromising, which requires her to accumulate the courage to actually defy him, which she eventually does in the Season 3 finale, physically, spectacularly, throwing herself out of a tower window with Soldier Boy to save everyone else. She survives. She lives a quiet life afterward, apparently. That's what redemption looks like in this show. Not triumphant, just getting out. Black Noir is a character who gets revealed properly in Season 3, and the reveal is one of the more genuinely unexpected things the show has done. The masked, silent member of the Seven, who seemed throughout Seasons 1 and 2 to be some kind of efficient, near-mechanical killing machine, turns out to have a significant and terrible history with Homelander. Without going too far into it, there's a reason Homelander kills him in Season 3 before Black Noir can react, and it has to do with what Black Noir knows and has been keeping from him. The reveal recontextualizes the character's silence throughout the early seasons as something much sadder than stoic competence. A-Train is, in some ways, the character who most clearly illustrates what it costs to exist in Homelander's orbit if you're not powerful enough to be immune to his influence. Jesse T. Usher plays him as someone who made a series of genuinely bad choices, decisions to be complicit, decisions to stay quiet, decisions to prioritize his own career over doing the right thing, and who spends the show slowly reckoning with what those choices have cost other people. His arc is the most traditionally redemptive in the show. He becomes, by the later seasons, an actual ally to the boys, and it costs him significantly. The Deep, played by Chase Crawford, is the show's primary comic relief character, and he is reliably, specifically, brilliantly terrible. His particular brand of terribleness is the kind that comes from a person who has some genuine grievances about how they've been treated, but who responds to those grievances by being awful to the people below him, while grovelling to the people above him. He's the character the show uses to illustrate how institutions perpetuate their own problems. The things done to him become things he does to others, and he never acquires enough self-awareness to break the cycle. What all of these characters have in common is that they exist in relationship to Homelander and are shaped by it, usually for the worse. The Seven is not a team in any meaningful sense. It's a collection of people who happen to work for the same company and who manage their proximity to Homelander with varying degrees of success. The power gradient between him and everyone else is absolute, and it poisons everything. Collaboration is impossible when one party could vaporize everyone else at any moment, and occasionally gives the impression of considering it. Starlight, Annie January, who joins the Seven in Season 1 as an idealistic newcomer, is the character who most clearly came in expecting heroism and got Homelander instead. Her arc is one of disillusionment and then resolve, figuring out how to be a real hero in an institution that doesn't reward or even recognize real heroism, and eventually choosing to be that thing outside the institution rather than continue to operate within it. She's the moral center the show keeps returning to, the character who whose standards the other characters are measured against, and her specific experience of the seven, the things she witnesses, the compromises she's pressured into, the choice she eventually makes is probably the closest the show comes to having a conventional protagonist. Homelander, notably, hates her for it. Not because she threatens him physically, she can't, but because she represents something he can't quite destroy or assimilate, which is a person who operates on principles that don't bend to fear or power. She keeps being right in ways he can't argue with, and keeps refusing to disappear. And that particular resilience is one of the things he finds most intolerable in another person. There's something quite telling in that. Of all the things that could threaten the most powerful man alive, the one that consistently gets under his skin is someone who simply refuses to be impressed by him and continues to show up anyway. Talking about the TV show Homelander without at least touching on the comics feels incomplete, because the differences between the two versions of the character are illuminating in interesting ways. The Boys as a comic was created by Garth Ennis and Derek Robertson starting in 2006. Ennis is a writer known for a specific kind of anarchic, transgressive, frequently very funny and very dark storytelling. Preacher, Punisher Max, Hitman, and The Boys is firmly in that tradition. It's more violent, more satirical, in a less subtle register, and takes the superhero critique further in certain directions than the show does. The comic Homelander is a simpler character, in some ways, though not a less interesting one. He's more purely a monster. His backstory is less humanizing than the show's version, and the show does a lot of work to give him the specific vulnerability and psychology that makes TV Homelander so compelling. In the comics, he's more of a satire target than a tragic figure, which is consistent with Ennis's general approach. Point the satirical cannon at the thing you want to critique and fire. One of the biggest differences between the comics and the show is the resolution of the Homelander story itself. In the comics, and this is a significant spoiler for the comic ending, just so you know, it turns out that many of the most terrible things Homelander believed he had done, things that were driving him toward complete breakdown, he hadn't actually done at all. Black Noir in the comics is a clone of Homelander, created by Vought as a contingency in case Homelander ever became unmanageable. And Black Noir committed those atrocities and framed Homelander for them, specifically to provoke Homelander into enough instability that Vought would authorize Black Noir to kill him. The discovery of this for comic Homelander is genuinely shattering. He loses his mind, and the ending, which involves Billy Butcher in classic Ennis fashion, making a choice that is equally horrible to Homelander's worst moments, is bleak and brutal, and very much a Garth Ennis ending. Everyone is terrible, power corrupts everything, the system perpetuates itself. The TV show took a different path. Black Noir exists in the show, but is a different character entirely, without the clone element. Homelander's psychology is more complex, his relationships more developed. The show adds Soldier Boy as a character who doesn't exist in quite the same form in the comics, which gives Homelander a parental arc the comics don't pursue. Ryan is in the show, but is handled quite differently in the comics. The show's version of Becca and what happened to her is also different from the comic version, quite significantly so, in ways that change the moral texture of Homelander's initial transgression and its consequences. The show, I think, made choices that are more emotionally nuanced, though the comics chose a kind of blunt transgression that makes a slightly different satirical point. What both versions share is the core thesis: superhero mythology is a product, a brand, a carefully managed fiction, and the people inside it are shaped by and trapped by that fiction in ways that are harmful to everyone. Both Homelanders are, in different registers, versions of the same critique, of celebrity, of power, of the gap between the image of heroism and its reality. One thing worth noting about the comic that the show hasn't done, or at least hasn't done to the same degree. Ennis is more interested in the explicit political satire element, in making the connection between superhero myth and American imperial self-image very direct. The show is interested in that too, but tends to do it through character rather than through the more blunt satirical moves the comic makes. Both approaches have their merits. The show reaches a larger audience and arguably makes the critique stick more precisely because you've spent years caring about these people. There's also the question of tone. Ennis's comic is genuinely funny in ways that are quite transgressive, dark, sometimes shocking, with a bluntness that television can't quite replicate for network and streaming reasons even in a show like this. The show has its moments of real darkness, but it's also somewhat more concerned with the emotional lives of its characters in a way that the comics, being more broadly satirical, are less interested in. Neither approach is wrong. They're doing different things with the same raw material. If you've never read the comics and you enjoy the show, I'd recommend them with the caveat that they're genuinely very different in texture. You might enjoy seeing where Ennis took certain ideas, and you'll certainly see how much the show changed in adaptation. The comics are finished, which is a nice thing. You get a complete story all at once, no waiting for seasons. And Ennis's ending is not the ending the show appears to be building toward, which means whatever Kripke has planned will be something different. Which is interesting, actually. This story can end in more than one way. There's something specific happening in the cultural conversation around Homelander that I find genuinely fascinating and also slightly alarming. And it's worth talking about because it connects directly to what the show is trying to do. Homelander has fans. Not fans of the boys who think he's a great villain. That's normal. That's how fiction works. You can appreciate a well-written antagonist without endorsing them. Fans who sincerely admire him. People who make fan art of him as the hero. People who quote his lines as inspiration. People who would, if asked, say they think he's right. People who look at a character who deliberately lets a plane full of people die to protect his PR image and see someone who is just telling it like it is. Kripke has addressed this in interviews with a kind of baffled directness. "What do you say to that?" he told an interviewer who asked about it. "The show's many things. Subtle isn't one of them." He said he finds it disturbing, which is understandable. And he's also been honest that it's not entirely surprising given the specific cultural moment the show has been telling this story in. Because here's the thing, Homelander is not subtle. He's a character who is explicitly modelled on a specific kind of right-wing celebrity authoritarian figure, and whose story is a critique of that figure. The fact that some people watch that critique and find themselves identifying with the object of it rather than the critique says something about where we are culturally, that is, depending on your mood, interesting or depressing. This is, weirdly, not a new phenomenon in narrative fiction. Tony Soprano has sincere fans who think he's a good guy, who made tough choices. Walter White has sincere fans who think he was cool and badass when the whole arc of the show is about a man who destroys everyone around him through ego and pride. Patrick Bateman, Gordon Gekko. Every charismatic villain in American pop culture accumulates a contingent of people who seem to be watching a fundamentally different story than everyone else. What's specific about Homelander is that the show is extremely conscious of this and has, particularly in seasons 3 and 4, been deliberately incorporating it into the story. His actual fan base in the show, the crowd that cheers when he kills someone at a rally, the militia types who show up wearing his merchandise, is the show's acknowledgement that it knows what's happening in the real world. The fictional Homelander fans are a mirror of the actual Homelander fans, and the show is pointing at them and saying, this is what this looks like from the outside. There's an academic concept called character capture, the idea that audiences sometimes lose critical distance from a character and start experiencing the narrative from their subjective position rather than evaluating them from outside it. Charismatic characters with screen time are particularly vulnerable to this because you spend so much time inside their experience that the outside view becomes harder to maintain. Homelander has enormous screen time, has a very compelling internal logic, is played with great empathy by Starr, and is, on the surface, extremely cool looking. Those factors combine to make character capture relatively easy for viewers who are already primed to sympathise with his specific worldview. What I find most interesting about this from a craft perspective is that Kripke and the writers have clearly thought about it. The show bends over backwards to show Homelander's harm. It doesn't let you forget the plane. It doesn't let you forget what he did to Becca. It doesn't let you forget the man he vaporized at the rally. Every time the show makes him compelling or sympathetic, it almost immediately cuts to a reminder of what he actually is. That the reminder doesn't land for some viewers isn't a failure of craft. It's a reflection of something about those viewers. The broader cultural resonance of the show is the thing Kripke has been most publicly thoughtful about. He wrote it as a satire of celebrity and corporate power initially, before the political dimension became so insistent. He's described watching certain real-world events happen that bore uncomfortable similarities to story beats he'd already written. A deeply unsettling experience when your speculative fiction turns out to be not very speculative. The show has been, as he's put it, a fairly reliable predictor of things it was never intended to predict, simply because the logic it was following was internally consistent enough that it arrived at the same places reality did. That's what good satire does when it's working. It extrapolates the logic of something that already exists and shows you where that logic leads. The Boys has been doing that across its entire run with American power, celebrity culture, and the mythology of heroism, and the ending of it, whatever it is, will be a statement about whether the logic of that extrapolation can be interrupted, can be escaped, can end somewhere other than where it appears to be going. That's a lot of weight for a show with laser eyes and extremely graphic superhero violence, but I think it carries it. Just about. A catch-all section for the things I kept wanting to mention and couldn't quite find the right place for in the earlier structure. The milk, let's address it properly because it comes up a lot. The recurring motif in seasons 1 and 2 involving Homelander and milk, drinking it, requesting it, the imagery of it is deliberate. It's not subtle symbolism. It connects directly to the Stillwell dynamic and to the infantile regression in his psychology, but it also has a visual quality that the show uses repeatedly in promotional material because it's such a distinctive and slightly wrong image. This powerful, imposing, armoured person with a glass of milk. It's the thing that makes him simultaneously absurd and sad in a way that straightforward menace wouldn't be. And it's genuinely funny, in a dark way, that the most powerful being on Earth drinks a lot of milk. The hallucinations of Stillwell are worth coming back to briefly, because they evolve in interesting ways across the seasons. In early appearances, they're relatively benign, her voice in his head, offering comfort, giving him approval. Later, they become a kind of internal negotiation, where his unconscious uses her form to work through whatever crisis he's in. By season 5, based on what we've seen so far, they're pushing him further rather than restraining him. Stillwell's hallucinated form now encouraging him to ascend, to become a god, to stop settling for the love of humans who are beneath him. It's the natural endpoint of that psychology. Once the internal mother figure stops being about comfort and becomes about ambition, there's nothing left pulling toward anything resembling ordinary human connection. The Seven Tower, and what it says about how Vought thinks about its own product. The building is a superhero gift shop. It's an experience destination. You can buy Homelander merchandise in the lobby. There are branded everything. The building is both the headquarters of the most powerful team of humans on Earth and a tourist attraction with a branded cafe. The mundane commercialization of it, the way Vought wraps extraordinary power in the apparatus of normal consumer culture, is one of the show's more effective details for communicating what supes actually are in this world. Products. Products who can melt your face off, but products. I'm also interested in the specific detail of Homelander's birth year, 1981 in the show, per the villain's wiki, though the show itself doesn't state it that explicitly. That makes him roughly in his mid to late 40s across the run of the show, which means he has existed as a public figure, as the face of American heroism, for somewhere north of 20 years by the time season 1 starts. And in all that time, with all that public attention and adoration, it hasn't filled the gap. It's never filled the gap. 20 plus years of being the most famous and beloved public figure in America, and he's still the child in the lab looking for someone to call him good. There's something in that specific duration that makes the tragedy more than personal. If the first few years of adulation had simply not been enough, but he'd found his way to something more genuine later, that would be a story about someone healing from a difficult childhood. The fact that it's been decades and it's still not enough says something more pessimistic about what that particular wound does when it goes unaddressed. It doesn't gradually fill with the love that's poured into it. It just gets bigger. The question of whether Homelander ages is one the show doesn't directly address, and I find genuinely curious. Compound 5 in adult supes doesn't seem to grant immortality. Characters age, characters die of ordinary causes or violent ones. But Homelander's specific origin, being engineered from conception rather than injected later, might mean different rules apply to him. Stormfront, who was given an early form of Compound 5, was functionally immortal for decades. Whether Homelander has similar longevity is something the show has never confirmed. It might not matter for the story's timeline, but it's an interesting question if you're thinking about the world the show has built. The possibility of a Homelander who outlives everyone, who is still here in 2050, in 2080, still needing the crowd to love him. That's a grimmer prospect than even what the current season is dealing with. And then there's the simple fact that his name, the name he chose, the name that replaced John on the wall in the facility, Homelander, is an interesting word to sit with. It implies belonging. It implies rootedness, being of a place. He named himself after the idea of home, of land, of being from somewhere. And he has no home. He has never had one. He was born in a lab, and raised in a lab, and moved into a corporate tower, and has lived for his entire existence in controlled environments he didn't choose. The name he chose is the thing he's never had. I don't know if that was deliberate symbolism on the writer's part or something that emerged from the satire of American patriotic imagery. Probably the latter, but it works as a detail. The man named Homelander has no home. I've been talking around Butcher for this whole video, and I want to spend a proper few minutes on him, because the Homelander-Butcher relationship is the spine of the show in a way that I don't think I've been giving it full credit for. Carl Urban's Billy Butcher is the other half of the show's central dynamic, the closest thing the show has to a protagonist, a role he holds very uncomfortably, given that he's almost as dangerous as the person he's trying to destroy, and frequently as willing to cause harm in the service of his goals. He's the leader of the boys. He was a former SAS operative, and his entire project in life, when we meet him, is finding a way to kill Homelander. That's it. That's his purpose, his meaning, his reason for getting up. Everything else, his team, his relationships, the collateral effects of his methods, is secondary to that goal. The thing about Butcher and Homelander as a paired antagonist dynamic is that the show is asking a specific question about them. Are they meaningfully different from each other? In their methods, in their willingness to sacrifice innocent people for their ends, in the way they treat the people around them as instruments rather than as fully real humans, are they actually distinct? The answer the show gives is somewhat, but less than Butcher would like to believe. Butcher is capable of genuine care, his relationship with Huey, his devotion to Becca's memory, his complicated but real feelings for Ryan, in a way that Homelander isn't. But he's also capable of extraordinary cruelty and manipulation in the service of his objectives. He dosed V24, the temporary soup drug, in Season 3 to even the playing field, which causes a brain tumour that's killing him, and he keeps going anyway. He lies to his team. He makes unilateral decisions that get people killed. He puts Ryan in impossible positions. He's not a good man. He's a person doing a necessary thing in the most morally compromised way possible. What I find most interesting about the Butcher-Homelander antagonism is that Homelander needs Butcher. In some way he can't fully articulate, Butcher sees through him. Not just through the PR performance, lots of people see through that, but through the vulnerability underneath it. Butcher, with his specific intelligence and his SAS training and his years of obsessive study of the target, has mapped Homelander's psychology more accurately than almost anyone. And Homelander, who can always feel when he's being truly seen, responds to that with a mixture of rage and something that resembles respect. Butcher isn't impressed by him and isn't afraid of him in the way other people are afraid. He's afraid of him in a tactical sense, understanding clearly what he can do, but not awed by him. And that non-awe is rare enough to be remarkable. The show builds toward a final confrontation between them from the very beginning. Season 5 appears to be where it lands. Butcher has the virus, a weapon capable of killing all supes, and the moral calculus of whether to use it is one of the season's central tensions. Using it kills Homelander. It also kills innocent supes. Starlight, who has powers now. Ryan, presumably others. It's the show's ultimate trolley problem, framed through the lens of a man who has been willing to run the trolley over a lot of people to get to Homelander. Whatever the final confrontation looks like, the show has been building toward it for a long time. And I think the reason the Homelander-Butcher dynamic has sustained the show's entire run is that both of them are, in different ways, men who are made into something hard and weaponized by systems that use them, and who are now operating as that weaponized thing without quite knowing how to stop. They recognize each other. Neither of them particularly wants to, but they do. Becca, in a very real sense, is the key to both of them. She's the thing Homelander violated and can never make right. She's the thing Butcher loved and spent years believing was taken from him, and then discovered was taken from him in a different and more complicated way than he'd thought. She's the person who raised Ryan with more love than either of her sons' fathers managed to offer. And she's been gone since the end of Season 2, and both Homelander and Butcher are still, in their different ways, acting in response to her. She's in the show less than almost any other major character in terms of screen time, and she might be the most important person in it. If you've seen the show and are familiar with the story, there are a handful of things I find much more interesting on a second viewing that I thought were worth mentioning. If you haven't seen it yet, and you're just here for the lore, this section is completely optional. Feel free to let it wash over you. The first thing I noticed on a rewatch is how much Homelander signals, with small physical behaviours that are easy to miss when you're tracking the plot. There's a specific thing he does when he's genuinely frightened, not performing fear, but actually feeling it, which is that his chin drops very slightly, and he goes very still, in a way that looks like control, but is actually the opposite. He does it with Stillwell when she's disappointed in him. He does it in Season 3 when Soldier Boy grabs him by the throat. He does it in Season 4 when the trial's going on. And there's a moment where he looks, very briefly, like someone who genuinely isn't sure what's going to happen. It's the child body language, surfacing. Star is very consistent about it. The second thing is how differently the show frames the crowd in different seasons. In Season 1, the crowd is mostly backdrop, people cheering for someone they have been told is a hero, not particularly characterized. By Season 3, the crowd starts getting specific faces, individual people who believe in him, who are shown as real people with their own lives, who have been convinced by Vaught's myth-making that Homelander is the answer to something. By Season 4, the crowd is a character in its own right. It has agency. It makes choices. It takes actions that Homelander didn't explicitly instruct. The crowd's evolution across the seasons parallels Homelander's. It starts as a tool and becomes something he created but can no longer fully control. There's also something interesting about the way the show handles time. It tends to skip large periods between seasons, roughly a year between Seasons 1 and 2, another year between 2 and 3, and so on. The cumulative effect is that by the time you're in Season 4, you're watching a world that's been living with this version of Homelander for 5 or 6 years. And the normalization is complete. He's not shocking anymore to the world in the show. He's just the thing that's true. The outrage infrastructure has been worn down by constant exposure until the outrageous things are simply the things that happen. That's a specific kind of horror the show builds very slowly and very deliberately, and it's more effective for being gradual. One more, because this one is my favourite, the specific way that the show uses food. Homelander is repeatedly shown eating, which sounds mundane, but it's the way he eats that's interesting. He eats with a kind of focused, almost childlike engagement that's quite different from how he does everything else. There's a scene in season 4 where he's eating cereal and watching the news, and he looks genuinely like a person having a normal morning for about 30 seconds. And then the news segment cuts to something that reminds you of what he is and what he's done, and the cereal is still there, and the ordinary morning image becomes deeply strange. The show does that constantly with domestic detail, using the mundane to make the monstrous more vivid by contrast. These small things accumulate into a texture that I think the show is quite proud of, and rightly so. It's a very precisely made piece of television underneath the extremely loud and graphic surface elements. The craft is there. It's just that a lot of the craft goes into things that only show up on the second or third time through. Well, that's the story of Homelander, more or less. From a laboratory in 1981, a baby who came into the world already frightening everyone around him, who was raised by scientists instead of parents, who was tested and conditioned and manipulated into a weapon, and then pointed at the public and told to smile, to a man who now controls the government of the most powerful country on Earth and has started telling people he's a god. It's quite a trajectory. I've been thinking, while putting this video together, about what it is that makes Homelander such a compelling character to spend time with, even fictional time, even at this hour of the night when you should arguably be asleep. And I think it comes back to what I said at the beginning. He's a sad character underneath everything, genuinely, profoundly sad in a way that the show never lets you completely forget, even when he's doing the worst things he does. The show is, at its root, about what power does when it's removed from accountability, about what happens when the mythology of heroism serves corporate and political interests instead of actual people, about the gap between the image of strength and what's underneath it. Those are ideas that are pretty resonant right now, for reasons that are probably obvious. But for me, personally, the thing that keeps drawing me back to Homelander specifically, as opposed to the broader show, is the child. The 5 or 6-year-old who liked Davy Crockett stories and cuddles and had a blanket that he cared about, who got turned into something else through a series of deliberate choices made by adults who should have known better, and who, in at least one case, did know better and did it anyway. The tragedy is not that he's a monster. The tragedy is that making him one required so much effort, took so many years, required such a sustained and systematic destruction of something that was there at the beginning. Whether the show ends with any kind of hope, whether Ryan can be something different, whether Homelander can be stopped in a way that means something, I don't know yet. The final season is still running. Whatever Kripke has planned for that final scene, I hope it's honest about the mess of it. Not tidy, not triumphant, not falsely comforting, just honest. And I think it will be. A show that has consistently refused easy resolutions for this long is a reasonable basis for trusting that the ending won't be one either. The show has always been willing to sit with the uncomfortable thing. The discomfort has been the point. What Homelander is and what made him that way, and what a world that produces people like that looks like from the inside, none of that resolves neatly. The best you can probably hope for is that it ends honestly, that the mess of it is acknowledged, and that the characters who tried to be something better than what the world made them are given their due. There's also the smaller, personal version of the question: what happens to John, if John is even still in there somewhere? The child who liked blankets and Davy Crockett stories. I'm not going to suggest he's redeemable. The show has been too thorough in its accounting of what he's done for that to be a satisfying conclusion, But there's a version of the ending that acknowledges he existed, that the person who became Homelander started as someone else, and that the someone else is part of the tragedy. I'm curious to see if the finale finds space for that. There'll be more videos. I've got a few ideas for what's coming next, and I'll mention them when I'm a bit further along with the research. If you've made it this far into the video and you're not already subscribed, now would be a good time if you like this sort of thing. And if you didn't end up watching it all, if you fell asleep somewhere around the lab experiments section, which honestly seems like a reasonable point to drift off, I hope it kept you company. There are a lot of great videos about the boys out there too, if you want more after this. Reviews, episode breakdowns, theory channels, the whole lot. Good community to fall into. It's late or early, depending on when you're watching this. Get some sleep. We'll still be here.